All right. This is going to be a tech talk with Mark Shust, and he's our tech lead at Jamerson. His Twitter handle and his email address are on that slide I'm showing right there. So feel free to jot that down and follow him, validate his feelings, send him an email if you got questions about the content of today's presentation. Some other social media handles for our company in general. The main Jamerson Twitter handle is Jamerson with an A, as you see on that slide, and TJ Gamble, our fearless leader and CEO, has a separate channel called eCommerce-aholic. So we'll take a look at those accounts when you can. And in addition to following us, watch us. In fact, we're going to be doing a live stream today at 2 p.m. Eastern in just a little while. Those are a little bit different. TJ rounds up people and talks to them, and it's a little bit more business oriented and just kind of for fun, as opposed to today's technical deep dive. So go to YouTube and search eCommerce-aholic for that. And if you just can't get enough of us, we also travel to different cities. If you're near any of these cities, look us up on the meetup.com platform. We're going to be in Charlotte, North Carolina on the 8th, Charleston, South Carolina on the 9th, and Jacksonville, Florida on May 10. We have done meetups also in Birmingham, Alabama, which is closest to where we are, in East Alabama in the Auburn, Opelika area. Also Nashville, Tennessee, and Cincinnati, Ohio. We'll probably get back to those cities in October. Search for Magento Meetup for those cities and you'll find us, or email me at gary@jamerson.com and I'll be glad to give you the links. Once Mark gets started, well, email me and I'll send you those links. And lastly, just a little bit about us. Most of you probably know who we are. We're a Magento professional solution partner. We're 100% Magento shop, and we pride ourselves on fast, accurate implementation of Magento builds and best practices in project management and technical expertise. So with that, I'm going to make Mark the host, and we will get started.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just a quick recap of how Gary introduced our company. We're a Magento solutions provider, and we are actually hiring. We're hiring a Magento developer and a front-end developer. So just a quick plug there. If you're looking for a position, Jamerson's a great place to work. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So this topic is all about Docker and Magento 2. So a while ago, when I was getting started with Magento 2, it was very hard to install and get running. It took me actually quite a long time to build the initial Docker images, but I identified Docker as a great system to build these images on, and just kind of took it from there. So it's been in development for over a year now. I actually had just a lot of recent changes and updates based on new tech that came out. But yeah, I'll just go over installing Magento with these Docker images, and then we'll dive into PHP Storm and getting Xdebug working all with it. So with that, let's get started. So prerequisites, I'm using a Mac, and this is really geared towards Mac developers, even though these Docker images do work on Windows and Linux as well. So you may have to change a few things, but Docker for Mac is really what it's geared towards. It is important you have a beefy system here. I'm running on a 16 gig quad core with an SSD drive. So really any recent MacBook Pro would be great. Magento is very file system heavy and intensive So you really do need a good system. There are some performance tuning changes. If you go to, here's the GitHub account here. It's my name, Marco Shust /docker-magento. So there's links here. I recently wrote a blog post on Docker tuning for Mac. So a few things to get started here. After you have Docker for Mac installed, go ahead and open up the preferences panel. A few things. Pretty much I remove all of the files and folders that are here by default and add in the composer directory, my sites directory, and library cache directory. So those three things are kind of the minimum. It may help host CPU if you remove the, I believe by default, it's the entire home directory. Some people have reported mixed results if this actually helps or not, but I just thought it's no reason not to do this. So that's the first step. Second step is the disk image. So on new versions of Docker for Mac, it comes in a raw format. So this file name will be docker-raw. Now in old versions, or there is a possible bug in Docker for Mac that sets us up as QCOW too. So you definitely want to use the raw file system. It's a new file system for Docker for Mac. And if you actually go to this blog post here and go to right here, there's a related blog post right here from someone else. It'll actually tell you how to change this to a Docker raw file format. Moving on, CPU. So for some reason, Docker reports 8 CPUs on a Mac. I'm not quite sure why, but pretty much set these to 4 CPU. It's half of the available CPU in memory. So this is 8 gigs. On some resource intensive projects, you may have to even up this to 10 or 12 gigs. Yeah, Magento takes a lot of CPU and system resources. More memory helps. So as much as you can devote to Docker for Mac as possible, do it. And the last step, if you go to this daemon tab and go to the advanced tab, by default, Docker uses the AUFS file system. So that's a pretty old file system. I believe Docker has been trying to change to overlay 2 for some time, and I don't actually know why it hasn't been done yet. But I also have a related separate blog post on that topic of how to switch this. It's pretty much you add in to this JSON config, you add in this property and restart. Now, doing that will blow away all your current Docker images and containers, so just be aware of that. I typically like to set this up before doing anything. And I run the stable version. Probably doesn't make too much of a difference. But yeah, yeah. Also, if anyone has any questions, feel free to leave it in the chat. I'll momentarily go to the chat panel and Q&A and see if there's any questions. Also have kind of an open Q&A a little bit at the end of the cast. On that, so now you have the prereqs done. We'll go into building our initial Magento 2 install. So from here, we could copy and paste this whole thing. I always work on sites in the sites directory and just copy and paste it in there. I will actually, I believe I had an existing site in here already. So what we want to do, I'm going to remove everything here. Just a moment. As I was playing through the demo, I must have forgot to clean some things up. But pretty much you copy and paste this and it will create and put you in a new Magento 2 folder. So that's going to clone out the there's a compose directory here and Magento 2. So this structure is going to match what this is. So you have a Docker compose file. So a Docker compose is a list of instructions and really services of starting your Docker containers. So I guess I'll backtrack a little bit. So there is a concept of images and containers in Docker. So the images I built are in this images folder. There's one for Nginx and a few for PHP, depending on the version, but they're pretty much all the same. The 5.6 version is geared towards Magento 1. So these Docker images will work for Magento 1 and 2, actually. So it's good to know. So Docker images are built and run from a Docker file. So a Docker file is a list of instructions of building your Docker image. So every one of these is considered a layer. We'll get into that in a little bit. But every command is a layer, and layers run sequentially to build your Docker image. We are using PHP 7.1 FPM Docker image as the base. Now, PHP supports, if you go to Docker PHP, they have an official library for running PHP on Docker, and it has every single version that you can imagine here. And they tell you how to run it. But we're just using that image as a base and installing some extensions. So this is almost equal to running, dropping into Ubuntu on the command line and just running these commands. It just runs the same every time you build it. So we're exposing port 9001. Because by default, PHP FPM, which is what we're using, runs on port 9000. And that is initially exposed by the official Docker PHP image. But we are actually installing also xdebug, which it also by default runs on port 9000. So we changed that to run on, the config file runs on port 9001 instead. So it doesn't conflict with PHP FPM. And the root of all of our files and folders is in var www html. That's just good to know for that. There's a couple chats here. I'm just gonna, yeah, the presentation is being recorded also, so you can go back and watch this later. But yeah, pretty much these images get built, and there's also Docker Hub. So these images are on Docker Hub also. Type in Docker Hub or Shust, Magento. They'll probably come right up. These are actually old images. Actually, that's the current image. So you could view build details here of when they got built, how big they are, the Docker file it's running against, and the all of the tags that are in here. So, so that's pretty much a Docker image, and we can specify config files that we're copying into the image. So, and you could actually override these and build your own images also. So it's fully customizable and extendable depending on what you want to do with your project. Here's your PHP ini file. Just some basic connections for xdebug and some reasonable memory limits. So that's Docker images. Docker containers is a running unit of Docker. So when you run your containers, they're running from a image you specify. So back to that Docker compose file. So this is saying run the Nginx 113 image and execute this service from this image. And you could also specify a lot of other flags and properties here. So I'll run down these briefly. So ports defines what ports we want to run and map from our host into the container. So right here, we are mapping port 80 on the host, which is my Mac, to port 8000 in the container, which is what Nginx runs under. If you have Apache or Nginx running locally on your Mac, you have two options. You can either change this port to something like 8001, or you can just, what I do is just disable PHP, Nginx, everything on my local, and I use Docker for everything. So it can bind to native ports. Links, so this, every one of these services runs in a jailed environment, which means it can't access anything else. It's kind of secure by default. So this app service cannot talk to this PHP FPM service unless we create a link. So right here, we're linking the DB service and the PHP FPM service so they can talk to one another. Volumes, here we're using what's called a YAML anchor. So this is it's actually been around for a long time in YAML. I don't think many people know about it, but what this does is create this assignment and assign it to this name so we can use it in other places within the Docker Compose file. So we don't have to repeat these lines on every single service. And the running PHP FPM on a socket instead of a port here. So that's where these this sock data comes into play. And I'll go over briefly with volumes too. So volumes allow us to stop and even delete our containers, but have data persist. So you can reboot your machine, restart, wipe out containers and everything, but keep the volumes here, and they'll persist all of that. So you definitely want to use that when you have data within the container that you want to keep, as data is Docker containers are immutable, like they won't persist restarts. So that's one of the gotchas of Docker. The PHP is pretty standard, and so is the cron. We're just specifying here to start off this script and using the same image here. So we have a cron running in a separate container. And for a database, we're using Percona, which is really a one-to-one, fully compatible image to MySQL. So it's pretty much exactly MySQL, but with performance enhancements. I used to use MariaDB, and I see a lot of Docker containers using MariaDB. Now, with the launch of MariaDB 10, they branched off from the 5.6, 5.7 branch of MySQL, and they are now introducing updates that could potentially not be compatible with MySQL. So that's why I do not use MariaDB anymore. Percona is a really good option right now because it has full one-to-one compatibility with MySQL. Same here, ports. I'm binding to the host, from the host port to the container port. So this makes it available so I can access this MySQL database service from my host. And we're also specifying an environment variable. This is pretty simple. So the environment variable we're using, or environment file here, sets some standards of, these are set from the Percona image. So if you go read the Percona README up on Docker Hub, they'll specify how you can set these up and use these. But pretty much we're just setting all of these to Magento for simplicity reasons. One last thing, the DB data. This varlib MySQL is where your MySQL databases are stored. So we want to persist that on the DB data volume so we don't lose our database on restarts. I'll pause there. I don't know if anyone has any questions about images and containers. That's kind of a really fast, brief overview of them and how they work with Docker Compose YAML files. You can run each of those containers separately, or you can run them. The Docker Compose file really makes it easy to run them all at once as a group. So that's what we're using here. Well, our next step after we check things out is to download Magento. So I created a bunch of helper scripts, and they're a little different depending on, we just actually recently had a nice pull request come in for Windows support on Magento 2, which is great. So I haven't tested that. I'm not a Windows guy, but I believe it all works properly. But this bin folder has helper scripts, so we can easily execute commands within Docker without really knowing Docker. I built these just to ease the knowledge of getting into this and using these images. So like the download file pretty much just runs this locally. It'll download it from Nexus, the version you specify. Some other things, you could just look into here and see what they do. Composer, I'm piping everything this bin CLI file, which pipes commands into Docker. So it's they're just little helper scripts, so you don't have to type this whole thing out every time you want to execute a command within Docker. Okay, so with that, I will download. There is a 2.2.3 version that came out. So we'll go ahead and download. They download pretty fast from Nexus. I'm on a good internet connection here too. So that is downloaded. And what that does is it downloads it and it exports it to the source directory on your host. So there's Magento 2. It's all downloaded. Next, we're going to set up this IP loopback. So this is something a little unique to the setup because we're using Xdebug, and there are some problems with networking on Xdebug with localhost. So all you have to do is do bin init loopback and type in your password for your Mac. I already have it loaded, so running this again really won't do anything. But what that does is download this and executes it. Or there's another file here. If we go into Magento 2 bin and loopback, what we're doing here is setting up this IP 10.254.254.254, and we're pretty much piping it into the network config as another alias for 127.0.0.1, which is localhost. This bypasses some of the weird stuff that can happen with Xdebug and networking, and also a couple other weird gotchas with Docker. So this is not a bad idea to use across all of your Docker projects, really. And what we're doing here is loading up that other plist file that I just opened. We're just saying start it on launch. So it pretty much just runs this every time the computer launches as a service. So now we can access our Docker containers with this IP. Next step is to add an entry to your Etsy host folder. So you got to use sudo here because this is a core file. All you want to do is add an entry. I just added one here recently, but you want to add an entry for 10.254.254.254 to whatever domain name you want to use. Now across this tutorial, I'm going to use magento2.test. So you can use any domain you want, but just be aware there's been a lot of movement recently on this. So I used to use .dev, and I think everyone used to, but Google owns that TLD now. So that will resolve to Google's server. So you no longer want to use .dev, and you actually don't want to use .localhost. This is another one I used to use because of the same issues with network routing within Xdebug. So .localhost will possibly think it's your local host machine instead of Docker. So .test is actually now, it always has been, but it's getting pretty popular. It's a reserved TLD that will never be used for anything else except local testing. So that's kind of what I've been using going forward. So set that up, save it, and it should be immediately accessible. And right now we will start our containers. So bin start. So what this is going to do is I don't have any of these. I cleared my system. I don't have any of these images downloaded on my machine. So it's going to download all of them layer by layer. So that those layers that I pointed out with run and copy commands, those are each batched in a separate layer. So that's kind of what a quick explanation of what's going on here. So it's downloading layer by layer and extracting it and storing it on my system in the Docker images cache. And it'll do this for every container and image that's not on our platform now. And then it's going to create the containers and start them up. And once MySQL takes the longest to start, once that starts, you'll get this message, ready for connections. That means Percona is running. And if we scroll up here, we can also see app 1 is our Nginx container, and you can see it started the worker process, and PHP FPM is ready to handle connections. So everything's running now and executing properly. So I typically keep this window open. Now what that bin start command does is just run Docker Compose up. So if you did want to run it in the background, you can change this script to have a -d flag, which runs it as a daemon mode in the background. So it doesn't take up a terminal window. But I kind of like to see what's going on and see log files here and just use a ton of tabs here. So now that our containers are running, we want to run this bin setup script. So if we open up bin setup, we'll see this executes a Docker Compose. And I just noticed I could probably replace this with the bin cli command up there. I'm repeating it, but what this does is run the Magento setup install command using whatever we specify with the params. So one gotcha here is the DB host. You'll notice it says DB. So that goes back to our Docker Compose YAML file. So if we call localhost within the app or PHP FPM containers, it's going to think it's localhost of this specific service, which doesn't exist, even though we're linking it in. So what the links does is expose the network. So it's other services available at that name. So DB is actually the host name we want to use because we specified it here as the name of the service. And these are also the params we set from the environment file of our Magento or MySQL container. The base URL, if you did want to use something else, this is where you want to change it. And then the credentials of the base admin user that's set up. This is just standard stuff that we can use here in a time zone. So you can go ahead and modify this however you want. And let me see, I have a quick question here. Okay, this is a good question. Can you run multiple Docker environments at once? So yes, you can. So Docker is very performant on memory. Before I go further, I will answer this. So you can run this complete same setup for a whole nother site at the same time you're running this Docker Compose setup. Now it's much more performant than VMs in the fact that I can have 100 containers running and it doesn't really use a ton of extra memory like a VM does. VM, you can only run 2 or 3 at once and then you're done. With Docker containers, you can really run a lot of them on the same system at once. Now, some gotchas, you can't, since I'm doing port binding here, I can't port bind the same service to the host. If I try to do that, it will say that you'll get an EADDR address in use error to the console, which means this host port is already mapped to another container or something's running on the host with that port. So you want to, this is popular in microservices with Docker. So you'd want to change this to 8001, 8002, something like that. Now, some other things you have to be concerned about there is your domain name will not work then because it's running on a different port. So to do that, you'd want to set up, I haven't got this far yet with my Docker images, but you want to set up an Nginx proxy on your host. And there's other ways of doing this too. But a simple way is setting up an Nginx proxy on your host. So let's say I had a Nginx config here. Well, let me pull up. Let's say I have an Nginx config here. I'll just write it right here. And I have a server directive, and I have I don't know if these are correct, but I'm probably pretty close in my findings. So Magento 1.test. And then I'm just writing pseudocode here to demonstrate. There's probably a lot more lines here, but you want to use a proxy pass directive to pass this request coming in, Magento 1.test, to your, let's say, app servers, something like that. And then we want to define a, I'm probably completely wrong here, but here, go look in Magento, these images here. Actually, I'll go back to my Magento 2. Actually, the Nginx configuration here. Here, upstream. So we want to define a upstream directive with a list of our servers. So in this case, we are going to define server 10, 254, 254, 254, 8,000. Let's say we have a server running there. And we also have to name this, yes, app servers. Now I could have another server here. Let's say I have another server directive for Magento 2.test. And I want to proxy pass it to app servers B. So in this case, I would define another upstream directive, app servers B, and set it up to look at 10, 254, 254, 254, 8001. So in this case, I have two different domains that I want to access by domain name. I am routing that port 80 request to a back-end proxy of whatever I define the port on for that Docker Compose file. So this is a brief intro. I'll have another write-up relating this because this is going to be a common solution or a problem that comes up. Right now, I'm just killing Docker containers and restarting the other site, which will work. But you probably want, at some point, you're going to want to run multiple sites at once. So this is kind of a quick way that you can get around that and have them accessible without using the port. Now, you don't even need to do that because if you want to be able to access it by port, then you just type in the port number in the web address. Okay, I got completely off topic there, so I will go back. So where we started off at is the setup script. So we went over this bin setup. So what we want to do is just execute. Also doing a couple other things here. I'm fixing permissions and turning on developer mode by default, and then re-indexing the whole site. It's something you do every time you install Magento 2. So let's run now bin setup. And you'll notice it immediately goes and starts installing composer files and things like that. Something I didn't mention here, you do want to set up, I have a README here of setting up composer authentication here. So on your host, I won't share my file here because it's my API credentials, but you want to create a file on your host, if you don't have one, in this location with your information on how to access this Magento Composer credentials. And there's a link here in the dev docs, good explanation of how to set these up, how to set up your auth keys here. So go ahead and do that. And we are mounting those inside of our Docker Compose YAML file right here. We're mounting them to this weird location that Magento 2 likes to use for Composer Home. But we're just mounting from our host into this location. So that auth file will get transferred in. And another plus of using or mounting this entire folder, I'm actually not doing it now, I don't think, but you can keep a cache on your host. So every time you go to install this within a container, it uses the cached version from your host instead of re-downloading it. So Magento was installed. We're just going to wait here, though. We're going to wait until this file system permissions completes. So what that does, might as well talk it over while I'm waiting. Fixed permissions just goes through all of the files and directories here and sets certain permissions, so all the permissions are correct. This is from Magento's dev docs here. And we also want to make the bin Magento file executable so we can execute it. I think it's pretty good. I don't know if anyone has any questions while we're waiting for this script to complete. I would not access the URL until this setup script is complete. I've had some weird issues last time I tried to do that. Just wait for it to complete. Now, the screencast also causes my computer to run a little slower than it usually does. So just be aware that things will be pretty performant. You're not screencasting this. But there are so many files and folders within Magento. Running commands like this does take a while.
Got a question from Raphael there.
Yeah, so it's our whole load time using sample data. Pretty quick. So, okay, we finally finished here. I've actually I see a different weird error every time I run this, and I never affects anything. I've never got this message output before. That's funny. It's okay, everything re-indexed. But yeah, well, let me, I'll get to that question in just a second since we finished it here. So now everything is installed, everything's re-indexed, developer mode has been turned on. So let's go ahead and try to access it. Magento 2.test. So this might be related to the question. So the initial load times are going to take a little while because it's Magento 2. So once, and if we open up the tab here, we can see the output from Nginx being loaded here with all of the files. Now, developer mode's turned on, so every single JavaScript file loads separately, every CSS file loads separately. It just takes a while for the first load. So once everything is cached, things seem to be pretty performant. Now the initial load times on some of these pages will take a little while. They should be close to native speed. Now Docker for Mac has made leaps and bounds also with performance with file systems lately in the last even few months. And one thing I should point out here also in the Docker Compose YAML file, when we define our volumes, I'm using delegated volumes. So delegated volumes says the container priority takes importance over the host. And it's really recommended for very large systems like Magento with many files. If you don't have this flag, you're probably going to choke pretty good on performance. That's fairly recent, I think, for Docker for Mac. So now if I reload the page, you'll notice it loads pretty quick. And if I go to new pages, the first time they'll load, the XML has to build out and it takes a little while, but generally pretty good performance though going on. And what I could actually do in the background is I will run, so with Magento 2, now here's an example. I'm running bin Magento locally. Now what that does, this bin Magento script, I'm piping it through this CLI helper into the Docker container. So it's being run on the Docker container, not my host. Most of these scripts will run like that. So even if I do bin CLI php-v, this is actually within the Docker container. So let's see, we're running 7113. That's just a good thing to know. Same thing with Composer. So the bin Composer file, I'm piping through to the Docker container, so we're not running Composer on our host. So running Composer on our host, I probably have a different version here. Yes, I do. 717 on my Mac. So the difference in version numbers is going to make your Composer auth file not be correct. Or Composer lock, Composer JSON. Those are usually pegged to the whatever version you're using to run the Composer install command. It may not be a big difference if it's a minor version like this, but if it's a major version or a major subversion, it's going to be a big difference with your Composer lock file. So you always want to run Composer with this bin Composer helper. So bin Magento, let me do, I'm going to run in the background this sample data deploy. So what that's going to do, difference with Magento 2 over Magento 1 is you can install sample data after the base Magento 2 code has been installed. So right here it's running. Let me see if I have a question. Does it support setting up existing projects instead of a fresh install? Absolutely. Actually, so that's a very good question. So in this folder I made and these files that I set up, the only thing specific to my setup is this env, the bin folder, and my Docker Compose YAML file. So in this source directory, this can be any Magento source code there is. So I'm actually using this setup at Jamerson and a project that has not been set up for Docker at all. I check out the source code into this source folder, and I set up my own, I set up my own bin env Docker Compose setup, and everything works. Now there might be a couple little gotchas that things that I just pointed out already with the database credentials, the host, you can be aware of that. But other than that, it all works, or it should work. Now, certain sites may have certain things that they do that might cause them not to work. But yeah, it will work with the existing project. So our sample data was installed. Another thing you got to do is run setup upgrade. So when you deploy sample data, it installs the modules, but it doesn't update the database. So setup upgrade will install, you'll see it'll install all of the sample config data and all the product data separately. So I'll just let it do that. But yeah, you definitely run this across any project that's Magento 2. You just might have to make some config changes. Now, that's another thing. Config changes, you actually can override these Docker images that I'm using the build. You can override them locally. So how you can do that, let me see. I'll just do this real quick. You want to change this to build, and let's say Nginx or images Nginx. So I could take that out, save this file, make a images Nginx directory, and create a Docker file here from this. And I could add my own directives. I could say copy, here, let me save this. I'll go in that folder, make a conf folder, and let's say I want to make my own, here's my own file. I'm not going to get into writing it right now, but I can make my own Nginx config file. And then in my Docker Compose, I copy conf nginx.config to wherever the default system is, kind of like what I'm doing. So I can copy it to etc Nginx. And now if I save this, that's all I need to do, and I'm overriding this image with whatever config file I want to do. And that's actually how I recommend to do it for Magento 1. You can actually, I believe I have a write-up there of how to, I actually might be using it inside. You can use this Magento 1 as an example. Here, it's exactly what I'm doing here. So in the Docker Compose, I'm using build images nginx. And it uses Dockerfile by default. That's exactly what I'm doing. And it's copying over this file. I can make this whatever I want. So this is how I can get a complete customizing or overriding of the base of what I want to do. You can even fork this project, build your own Docker images, throw them up on Docker Hub. You know, I don't care. Whatever your project intends to. This is all MIT licensed, so you can kind of pretty much do whatever you want there. Another question, can the source directory be mapped to another location on the host file system? Yep. So you can map, that's a good question. So in your Docker Compose YAML, I got to reset this because it's going to get screwed up from my, oh great, I didn't commit it, so. Hang on. I'm going to reset this before I forget. I will reset this to this. So we're not using our custom build. Oop. Okay, and then I'll erase my images. But yeah, you can map this source directory anywhere you want on your host. So right here, if I wanted to call this home, or let's say another directory source, or whatever I want to do, hello, that's where it's going to look for the directory, and it's just going to map it into this directory. So you can name it whatever you want. I just use source as kind of a standard. One thing you do have to make sure, if you do that, you have to go into your Docker and add that folder into your file sharing and restart Docker. So if you don't do that, Docker for Mac won't be listing on that directory. So you just have to make sure you do that. Let me make sure my image is there. So one other question, do you plan to implement Mage Run natively? Yeah, I mean, I believe it works if you, so something like, let's say Mage Run, let's say I have a script, can't remember exactly what it's, I haven't used it much myself, but let's say I have a bin, I'm going to copy bin Magento to bin Mage Run. So let's say I had a custom script that I wanted to run here. All I have to do, so that's, since I just did that, that is actually automatically, you know, we have a bidirectional sync here. So a quick rundown. Docker, I completely forgot to cover. Docker PS shows you all of your running containers. Docker PS-A shows containers that are running or not running, so all of your containers. You have a container ID, you can reference the image it's built from, and you have all the port mappings here. By default, also Docker Compose uses your current directory, which is Magento 2, as the base name of how to name all of these containers, with the service name following it, suffixed with looks like an _1. So another command is Docker images. It'll show you all of the images that are cached on your local machine. So these are everything I have cached. If I had other things I can, or other images, I can have as many as I want here. They just take up disk space. And you can reference them by image ID or a repository tag. So I thought I'd touch on that first. But if I go to my Docker PS, and I can drop into, or I might as well use my bin cli directory. If I do ls bin, it's going to show me what's inside my Docker containers, and I can see that mage run file here. Now, if I wanted to set up something where I wanted to run that script through Docker, but from my host, I can copy this bin Magento file to bin. I'm talking outside of the Magento source now. Bin mage run, and I can go into. Oops. I can go into here and change this to bin mage run. So at that point, I right now created a helper script. I can type in bin mage run. Right now it's the exact same as Magento. So there you go. I just connected through Docker and ran that script. I'll just leave that there. But yeah, you can customize this however you want. I could probably add that in, but I kind of take the approach of keeping anything that's custom or anything that's not core or base outside of these Docker images. If there's something you want to add, feel free to add it, fork it, create your own. But typically on these, I am not opinionated at all. I like base images and not too much fluff and not too many, additional software packages. I added Xdebug. We got that working in there. So a few other things I plan on adding, but not a whole lot. I'll probably add on a memcache directive here just as a sample, but it's very simple to add memcache or Redis to this also. So another question, your image have all requirements for Magento 2 commerce. I actually haven't tested this with commerce. It should work. It's my question. I'm definitely open to PRs, and like if you have contributions you want to make, feel free. Like I just got that awesome merge request in I believe last 2 weeks ago. This is great. So he wanted Windows support. I'm like, I don't have Windows. I won't do it, but I'll take a PR for it. And lo and behold, I have a giant PR for Windows support. So that's great. And that's how you can contribute and kind of give back. I definitely can't do all this all myself. So it's these source codes and things, open source really works on your contributions more than anything. So, okay, now we had, I completely got off topic again, but I guess that's good. We have our, I don't know if it cleared the cache or not, but we should have our sample data installed here. Looks like it did clear the cache because it's taking a while to load. So just by running that sample data deploy and set up upgrade scripts, we now have sample data. There you go. So now you have your whole site on sample data, and you can navigate through. So that's definitely something you want to do if you're testing this out, and you're a module developer, and you want to test out your code using that. But there you go, everything's working great, and everything's also syncing back to the host. So even the generated folder is synced back to my host. And we will get back into that also. I think the next topic here is Xdebug. So I think we're about an hour here, but we'll just keep going. I guess if no one has any other questions or anything, I'll just keep going. So this whole cast, again, it's being recorded. So feel free to, if you need to hop off, and it will be recorded and you can dive back in. But so now we have everything working and connecting to the to container to our host. Let's go ahead and get Xdebug working. So let's open up PHP Storm. There's definitely a couple gotchas here, and this took a while to figure out. We'll create a new project, call this Magento 2, because that's where our site is. Don't worry about these languages yet. Just go ahead and create it. I'll ask if you want to create from existing sources, say yes. a couple questions while this loads. I'd like to know, we aren't using varnish. It's kind of, it goes back to that it's too opinionated. You know, varnish isn't out of the box by Magento, so I leave it out. If it is out of the box, I didn't know that. Yeah, so, you know, varnish can definitely be added in. Another question, any plans of adding Magento or PHP 7.2 image? Yes, as long as, or as soon as Magento supports it. Magento has been a little lagging behind PHP versions. They just recently had 7.1 support. So as soon as they have 7.2 support, I haven't actually tested out 2.2.3. I don't know if it has 7.2 support. If it does, I'll definitely, I definitely plan on supporting new versions, but I won't release it until I test it and make sure it works for myself. So yeah, as soon as Magento 2 supports 7.2, I will have an image shortly after. So while PHP Storm is indexing here, so this is my project root. First step, yep, Magento does not have support yet. For 7.2, I guess it's coming. Cool. I think that's a Magento employee there. So let's go to preferences and go to languages and frameworks and expand the PHP and debug toggles here. And now we can change to 7.1. And we don't have an interpreter here. Let's go ahead and add it. We'll create one from Docker. Now, if we go to Docker and compose, you'll get this image or this error parsing Docker compose YAML. This is because this PHP Storm 2013 or 2017-3 doesn't support YAML anchors, which is what I'm using. So quick fix, just don't use that. Create a new server here, Docker for Mac, hit OK. Pick your image name, 7.1. So hopefully, I believe in the next version, they did fix the YAML anchor issue. So that will be out in the next version of PHP Storm. Not a big deal though. I don't know what the difference is between selecting a regular Docker container or using one from your Docker compose file. But here, it went ahead and pulled our exact version out. You'll notice though that debugger says not installed. For some reason, PHP Storm doesn't see it. So I have a script here. All we do is add it here. And you always get this, do you want to add file to Git? I just say no, don't ask me again. But after we paste this in, hit refresh, and you'll see it will now find Xdebug, which is great. So we're done here. Let's go ahead and OK out of this. Next thing we want to do is set up this Docker container volume binding. So delete whatever's here. Let's go ahead, and our container path again is var www html, and we want to map that to source. Hit OK, hit OK, and you notice this also sets up a project mapping up here, so we don't have to do that. So that's set. And all of this is written out, so you don't really have to memorize all of this because there's a lot to take in. Debug, change this debug port. Again, since we have PHP FPM listening on port 9000, set up Xdebug to listen on 9001. So let's change that there and go to this DBG proxy, type in our PHP Storm ID key, and the host is 10.254.254.254. So that way we will ensure we find the correct debugger here. Just go to servers, let's create one. We'll call it magento2.test. Host magento2.test. Now for some reason, it looks for the container port here. Maybe because We set up that client interpreter to look at the Docker for Mac. I don't know how this works, but 8,000 is what you want, not 80. And set up a port mapping from source, again, to var www HTML. It'd be nice to set this up once, but you got to do this port mapping, it seems, in many different places to get everything working correctly. That's it here. And now what we'll do, I'm getting all these Docker file detections, I'm just closing them out. We go to run edit config, and we're going to create a new remote debug connection here, magento2.test. Let's filter by server and type in that PHP storm again. Now you can't validate here. It won't work for some reason. Don't know why, even though everything works fine. So you could just skip that, assume it works. And now if we go to debug, it won't work because we didn't enable xdebug within our containers. So again, if we do php-v, we don't see xdebug installed here. So there's another helper here, bin xdebug, and type in enable. And now it's been enabled, and we do see it here, but PHP has to be restarted for the config to take effect. So let's do Control-C. It'll stop all the containers. Wait for them to all die. Sometimes it takes longer to kill the database than the other ones. You notice the Nginx and PHP containers stopped immediately, and database takes a while. It's kind of the same thing in the inverse, but just restart them. So now we have, you'll notice, I'm in the wrong tab here. You'll notice xdebug is still enabled here. Our config changes are persisting. So now, if we go back here, you want to make sure you have this xdebug helper installed. So this is a Chrome extension that you need to set your IDE key from Chrome. And you want to go to the xdebug helper options here and make sure PHP Storm is selected, and this is what it says. After that, you want to enable it. So by default, it's not enabled. Make sure this little bug is green. It is enabled for me. So if I refresh, now things take a little longer to load with xdebug in here, but probably not too much. Now what we're going to do is go into source pub index, because that's our entry point for Magento 2. And I'll set a breakpoint here. And I will debug Magento 2. So now if I load it, I have my breakpoint triggered. And I can see I'm getting all my mage cookies and everything, so I know everything's working. So this is great. If you're ever trying to debug anything, you need xdebug. And it's working. So xdebug's running on the container, and I'm connecting to it from my host through this remote debugger, which is great. And I can page through and it'll load. So same thing on anything I access, I'll get a breakpoint that's triggered. And I can go ahead and identify everything here. So great to have xdebug here. I blew through that xdebug part. That took me a lot longer when I went through this a couple days ago. So yeah, so that's generally it. So now I have Magento 2 working. Maybe I can cover a couple other things here, but you know, as I killed the containers and restarted, that's very quick to do. So here they got killed pretty quick. So when I have multiple projects going, I usually just kill them and go to the other folder and then start it back up. So it's pretty quick to toggle back and forth. It's nothing like a VM where you have to power down and wait minutes and all that stuff. One other thing I'll show you, a huge benefit of Docker is how things work with versions. So I'm running 7.1. Well, this will all run with 7.0 too, or let's say 7.2 comes out and I want to run it. All I have to do is change these. Now I don't have any 7.2 images out, but I'll use 7.0 as an example because that is out. I change these to 7.0. I think it's only those two. let me, oops. Let me save it and I'll run that bin start. It's pulling the 7.0 image now. And it's going to start right up. So it's pulling that 7.0 build that I also have. Starting it. There, it's ready. Let me refresh the page. Man, it's hitting. And when I do bin cli php-v, oh, I'm in the wrong folder. I am running 7.0. That's pretty awesome. And you'll notice that xdebug is not there because I'm using a completely different container. But yeah, that's how quick you can switch PHP versions. So let me kill that. Sometimes you'll get that. So I did that. The containers are probably still running. So another option you could do is docker compose stop. If I wanted to destroy a specific container, there's two ways I can do that. I'll wait for these to finish. You got to stop it first before you delete a container. So docker ps-a shows me all my containers that are exited or not running. I could delete it by container ID. So let's say I wanted to kill this nginx docker rm container ID. So now it's gone. And I could also delete it by name. So I could do docker rm name. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong name. This is the name you want, docker rm. There, it's deleted. So, and then you could also do docker compose rm, which will blow away all of the containers related to the docker compose file. And images. So these are all of the, we have docker images and we have docker volume ls. And you'll see some other containers I just have persisting here for other projects. But I can destroy specific volumes by, I'll destroy this stock data, docker volume rm, the name. And images, let's say I wanted to get rid of the 7.0 image, because let's say I'm not using it. I could delete it by name, docker rmi name tag, and it deletes it, and it'll show all the layers that it deleted also. Or I could also delete it by image ID, docker rmi image ID. So that's how you can clean up. And you could also do docker system prune-a, I believe. And it will remove everything relating to Docker. Images, networks. I don't think it removes volumes, which is great. I will not do that now. But yeah, that's a quick way to print out everything on your machine. So I guess that's pretty much all I want to cover. Okay, I have a comment here. Xdebug can also be enabled by PHP Storm. Great. I haven't tested that out. So Joseph, reach out to me, tell me how I could do that. Said it speeds up command line operations. So that sounds cool. And another question, does Xdebug also work for the CLI? It does, I guess, if you do it my method. So conflict with just what Joseph just said. So command line interface. Now, when I bin xdebug enable, oh, I have no container. But if I, even though I have this error, I have this message. If I do a php-v and I see xdebug on that, then that's how I can tell it's enabled on the CLI. Any other questions? I actually scheduled for about an hour and a half. I knew this would take a while, but yeah, I mean, other things, you know, to get your app Etsy env file, you have your admin key you can get there. And all of this is just regular. So you can go and edit, create modules and everything locally here. It's just like a regular Magento site, bidirectional sync, and speed should be okay. So If anyone else doesn't have any other questions, I guess we'll wrap up here. Another plug, yeah, we are still hiring. So if you are interested in a Magento position, you have Magento experience, Jamerson is definitely looking for developers right now. So reach out to us. We have a job posting, I believe on Indeed and LinkedIn. So just look
Correct.
around or reach out to us. Yeah, I'll hand it off to Gary here.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and hope everybody got something out of that. And as Mark mentioned, we do have openings, so look us up. Probably best way to find it is on LinkedIn, or feel free to email me. I'll drop my email address in the chat one more time. And if you are in some kind of position where you might be looking for help with a project as an agency, just give us a yell on that too. If you're looking, as Mark mentioned, we do have an opening, so let us know about that, and we'd love to help you any way we can. So thanks for everybody for coming out. We had a great participation, great crowd, and we'll see you later.
Yep, thanks a lot.